Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed, and we're back hanging out.
We are.
The last thing we talked about was our celebrity lookalikes.
Uh-oh.
No, the last thing we talked about was Love is Blind.
Okay.
Let's start with that.
That's true. Have y'all caught up on Love is Blind?
I can't
say that I have.
It's a big reunion this week, so we're pretty excited.
Oh, is it like the behind the scenes kind of?
I will say this, not that a lot of y'all care, but last night, the Mavericks game was moved to WFAA.
This on Instagram.
And which is the same channel as The Bachelor.
I saw on Instagram, I was like, Isaac's two worlds collide with Mavs game preempting The Bachelor, they were running it later at night. So
did I have Mavs employees texting me saying, hey, are you conflicted?
Yeah, when your two loves.
But Barb was losing her mind because there was a scroll bar that came across the screen saying,
oh, no.
The Bachelor will air at 2:11 in the morning.
Oh,
so,
no.
Specific. And, so we didn't watch
I thought you were going to get Bachelor results in a scroll, which is like the last thing that you want.
Yeah, it's a big week for Joey and stuff right now. So
unbelievable.
Okay,
how many listeners have we lost just in the big opening banter this morning?
But some of you all really connected right now.
They're just not going to admit it, though.
No,
like as readily as you do.
I don't know. We'll talk. We'll talk on Sunday. So we're like right on the doorstep of. Or what's today's date?
Yeah, today's
the 12th, March 12th.
March 12th.
Recording this.
4 years ago is when everything started shutting down.
Mm-hmm.
It's, on one hand, I remember it like it was yesterday. Mm-hmm. On another hand, it feels like it's been forever
ago.
Of how much stuff has happened since then, of March 2020. So today we're going to talk about what the church looks like now, 4 years later. The church was forever changed that year, and what does it look like now? How has IBC changed? How has the big church changed? And so let's just start there. 4 years ago, where were you? What was going on?
Yeah, I was on spring break in.
Whoa!
I was on spring break, but in the Texas Hill Country. Don't get too excited. We weren't like in Panama City.
I was
or
just saying,
whatever.
Panama.
Yeah.
Like what?
No, I was in. It was actually beautiful. Texas Hill Country, just right outside of Austin, staying at resort. I'm not sure that's the right word for it, but like hotel. And I remember hearing like this is going on, but not really sure what's happening. Didn't think it was like that big a deal. And Brian Eck, our executive pastor, calling me like twice that week saying, here's what's happening. We're shutting things down this Sunday. We're going to go online. And that's when I realized it was about Wednesday or Thursday. And I realized, oh, this is like bigger than I think. Because everything was really normal at the place we were staying. There was no change. And that's when we decided we should cut this vacation short. Something's going on. We don't really know. It's better to get back home. So that's what happened to me.
Yeah. So we were on a trip to Israel. We were in the Holy Lands leading a tour. And so for the days leading up to our departure to come home, we flew home on March 12th. And so for the days leading up to that, we were seeing news reports and trying to keep people from getting too freaked out, on the tour bus. And then by the last couple of days in the city of Jerusalem, like everything was closing down. There were no people out on the streets. It was eerie almost. And so we flew home on the 12th, which was the day that flights from Europe all started to be shut down. And everything really started. I think March 12th is a pretty significant date in all of that. So we flew home, made it back in. We actually had some friends that were on the same trip that routed their trip back through Paris, and we're going to spend a couple of days there. And they got stuck, and it was just nuts for them.
That was my next question.
Try to get home.
If your flight was like 2 days later, would you have been?
Yeah. So we were routed through just a layover in London, and they were still allowing, I think, some things from London. But yeah, it was just crazy. So I get home. Our kids had kind of been dispersed out a little bit to stay with other people. And we had one of them with us, our daughter, and then our two sons were staying with some friends. Well, we had been on a plane. We had been exposed. We felt like we probably need to be quarantined from them. And so they ended up staying another 10 days or something with friends of ours. My mother, who lives with us, ended up checking into a hotel. So our family's all kind of split up just to really try to make sure that we're doing what we can to, to stay safe and in case of exposure or whatever. So I remember got back and got caught up in everything that was happening, and sitting in my office here at the church making a video saying, hey, this Sunday we're going all online. It's not something that we're doing out of fear, but we want to just be cautious. Mm-hmm. We want to do what we can to love our neighbors, to try to help. We remember talking a lot about flattening the curve at that time. And so, and so that first week we shifted, and first time to just preach straight into a camera. It was a crazy experience, that's for sure.
I wasn't here at IBC at that time. I came almost a year right after that, or a year later. There's no playbook for this, especially for the church. What did decision making, what did that process look like? What do you remember about the early weeks, months of COVID here at IBC? Yeah,
I mean, I think this is one of the ways where, at least as a staff, and I think as a church too, we are in some ways at our best of we're having to think on our feet. We don't have all the information. We're just trying to make the next best decision, and just the adaptability and the flexibility of our staff to say, okay, here's what's going on. How do we respond to this? Well, it means we have to change in some ways overnight. And how do we still do something that's going to be helpful to people and help people feel engaged to the church, yet we can actually be in person. Mm-hmm. And so I would say initially it was almost every day, and then it was every week we're trying to figure out what's the next thing to do for this week, because it was changing that quickly.
Yeah. I mean, our senior leadership team, for quite a while there at the beginning, we were hopping on the Zoom call every morning daily. And just checking in and kind of processing where we were and next steps. Of course, for us making big decisions about closing down and reopening and all that was very much something that the elders were a part of. So we were meeting regularly over Zoom and processing all those things together. And, I look back on it, and I didn't have this framework at the time, but I feel like it actually describes kind of the way that we intuitively operated through some of that. And of course, we were making decisions on the fly. Nobody knew the right next step to make. And there were all kinds of things that got questioned and criticized along the way from a variety of different angles. But the framework that I've talked a lot with our staff about in the post-pandemic period that I think is intuitively how we operated are these principles that I first came across from Todd Bolsinger in his book, Canoeing the Mountains. Start with conviction. And so we were trying to determine what are the convictions that are really going to guide us in our decision-making. And it really was about love of neighbor. It was about what is the thing that we can do, what kind of choices that we can make that really allow us to try to practice that idea of loving our neighbor, loving our one another's within the Christian community, and allowing some of those kinds of convictions really to guide us. Start with conviction, stay calm. And so a big part of those early days especially were, how do we sort of manage the anxiety that this most overused word of 2020, unprecedented situation created for us. And so really trying to do a lot of work around that idea of dealing with the anxiety that this situation created. Start with conviction, stay calm, stay connected. And so a big part of what we tried to do with our staff and with our congregation was, how do we strengthen that sense of connectedness through this challenging time? One of the very first things that we instituted actually was a daily devotional, that I began to do a Facebook Live daily devotional at Gospel of John. And I thought by the time I got through the Gospel of John, we'd be done and, changing to something else, potentially back in person. And, we had no idea the duration of this thing. And of course, the daily ended up being something that we did for about 3 years before we launched this podcast a year ago. And so start with conviction, stay calm, stay connected. The navigating the uncertainties of an unknown future requires us to really stay connected with one another, and then finally stay the course. Just that call to patient endurance that you see repeated as a call to believers in the New Testament, to patiently endure, to keep going, no matter the challenges that we faced along the way, no matter the criticisms or the folks that were saying, should be doing this and be doing that.
Right.
So just continue to persevere, stay the course.
I think also thinking through, we had a really unique opportunity to address needs both in the community and in our body, where it just brought up some really significant needs that people had. And how do we as a church now step into this in this moment of we can really help address the needs of people with the love and the compassion and the care of Jesus? How do we do that in this moment that's not a little bit different, that's very different than what we're used to? And so I think it was an opportunity to think through that as well.
As leaders, was there something that you learned about yourself in those first months or year of that?
I think back to those words.
You could probably write a book, can't you? Yeah.
I have some notes for a book. I have the chapters all outlined.
That's right.
And maybe some point. But I look back and I think about those words from the Apostle Paul, who says, the famous passage where he pleads with God to take his thorn away. And the Lord speaks and says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And so Paul says, therefore I boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses and hardships and persecutions, trials. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong, right? If it's true that God's strength is perfected in our weakness, then we don't really experience God's strength until our weakness is really exposed. And I absolutely look back and feel like all of my weaknesses were really exposed. And I think a big one for me as a leader was my desire for affirmation, for the desire to be approved of. If I think about sort of the old me, what is the thing, Barry, that you fear the most? I think the thing that I would say I fear the most is disappointing people. And there were all kinds of decisions that we were having to make through that entire season of time that inevitably caused a sense of disappointment. And so for me, really learning to actually deal with some of the criticism, some that sometimes was harsh, mean. And of course, a lot of what was going on in that time just got highly politicized. And so you had people taking sides. I think about, one of the greatest preaching gaffes, certainly of my preaching career, but also maybe that have come across, was actually that very first Sunday that we were all online. I don't know if we talked about this. You weren't around at the time, but I was setting up to talk about what Sissy just said about this is our opportunity to love our neighbors and serve our community and meet people in needs. And was telling stories about the ancient church and the way that during plagues they showed up and this was a significant way the church grew through this period of time. So looking back at our history, and now we have this moment in front of us, and the whole sermon is building this to this crescendo.
And he's there.
It's just passionate, telling the story about Winston Churchill aspiring the people of England and I'm building up to this final line, which is Churchill's line, "This could be our finest hour." The only problem was, when I'm staring into the camera, delivering this impassioned line, "This could be our finest hour," what came out was not the word finest. It was final. That at the beginning of a global pandemic, the pastor just said, "This could be our final hour." And of course, I caught myself in real time. I was like, no, not final. But it was unbelievable, right?
William Wallace delivering a speech.
This could be our final hour. But I do look back, and not just thinking about our church in particular, but the church in North America through that season. It feels like it was sort of a finest hour that wasn't, right? That we actually had an opportunity. And yet part of what happened is, I think back to, we did an episode about 9/11 and just the remarkable way that 9/11 brought people together. And you would hope that something like a global pandemic would have the same kind of bring people together impact. And unfortunately, it tended to have the opposite kind of impact. It pulled us more and more apart. And so, through that season, and even then when we made decisions to reopen, within the same week, I got somebody upset because we hadn't reopened. And it was, I'm ashamed of you I'm ashamed of us. We're losing our church for poor leadership. And then we announce that we're reopening, and I get somebody who's, I can't believe you would do this. Makes me question whether you love people at all. I don't think I could ever come back to a church. And so, getting this really harsh reaction from both directions over trying to navigate, these decisions. And so for me, this was actually a really significant moment of growth as a leader to say, how can I lead with courage and conviction and love, even when doing that means not everybody's going to be happy with me. Not everybody's going to approve of me and the decisions that and of course, not just me. I was making these decisions certainly with a team of people around me. And yet that was a really big a growth moment for me. I think the next year, 2021, was one of the most significant seasons of spiritual formation in my life, just learning the lessons from what we've been through and growing through that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the very same thing. I think for me, and I would say I didn't know it in the moment, but the pandemic and 2020, 2021 were probably some of the most important years of significant spiritual formation in my life in ways that I didn't know I needed. One thing I remember saying during that time was, don't waste a good pandemic, that this could be such an important spiritual formation tool. And yet I didn't realize all the ways I needed that to happen, where I needed God to work in my life to just really, I was able to really see these places of idolatry and attachments, things that I was anxious about that really pointed to things I was worshiping more than God or placing a higher priority on than God. What I was worried about pointed to what I was actually worshiping, and God really stripping away so much of that I feel like I've come out of that in a much healthier way. But I had no idea I needed those things in the moment. And so God's just graciousness to work in a really hard way, and yet just this important time of significant spiritual formation for me.
How would you say the church has changed the most since then, 4 years ago? Big C Church.
So I think one of the immediate reactions of the church was because we can't meet in person, was to go online. Some churches had that online platform already. Others had to scramble to put that together. But I think that what's come from that is that online is just really become part of this normal way for us to do church. And in some ways a significant way, because that has now become the front door of, if people are checking out a church, they're going to your website. They're going to go watch a service or listen to a podcast or whatever it is. And so I think that's become important in that sense. I think there's this other thing, and I don't have all the statistics around this, where maybe people were coming to church twice a month in person, but then they're not coming for the other two weeks. Well, now I think a lot of times people will come in person for 2 weeks, but then instead of not being connected at all, they're joining online. And so there's a sense in which people are maybe more connected because of that online aspect, and yet they're also not as connected because they're not here in person. So it's a little bit different. And so I don't know. I don't have all the statistics on. There's actually greater connection because we have online, but I do think that's changed how we do church, and it's not going away. At the very same time, while we are increasingly using that online presence and people are participating in that way, I think what the pandemic really highlighted, and this wasn't because of the pandemic, I think we were living in this way before, but the pandemic really brought it to the forefront. It was the isolation and the loneliness that people were living in that then just we're acutely aware of because we're sheltering in place, right? We're all stuck in our homes. And whether you were single or married, you had a family and you were living with other people or alone, I think everyone experienced to some extent that kind of, I don't have this kind of community that maybe I wasn't really aware of. And so it's brought out that need for connection and community. I think what people really look for a church now is not necessarily there's got to be this amazing preacher. That's important. I'm not saying that's not an important part of how we do church and how we grow. And yet, if you want to hear great preaching, you turn on a podcast, right? Yeah. You can go to online in a variety of ways. But what you can't get from those places is authentic community and connection where we walk together as brothers and sisters in Christ, pursuing life with Jesus together. And I think that's what the pandemic showed us and what people are really longing for since then.
Yeah, I think you hit the really significant parts of that. A couple things to kind of underscore. So, one thing that churches across the country, I think, saw during this period of time, I heard it described this way, and certainly kind of rang true for us, is you can think about your church in thirds, and a third of the people said, I'm out, right? And that was for a variety of reasons. For some, it was the response to COVID. For some, it was other things that were happening in terms of issues of racial justice. This was, of course, the same period of time as George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. And so response to social things that were happening, or just that year and its politics. So some of that third would be related to those things. But then the significant part of it wasn't so much that. It was just, well, when we were at home, we kind of got out of the habit, or maybe we'd been on the fence at this church for a while, but we weren't going to make a change, and then this caused a break in our attendance, and now it's easier for us to go to the church that's just closer to where we live. I heard a lot of people that just said, hey, we love IBC, but we got this great church right down the road from us, and it just felt like the right time to kind of make a shift. And so a lot of churches kind of lost about a third of the people. Then you had a third of people said, I'm out. You had a third of the people said, I'm in. And like they were in before, but even more in now. And I look back and I think of some specific names and faces of like, these are the people that were just all in, and they're more all in now than they were prior to the pandemic. And then that third in the middle who's going, I'm kind of waiting to see how this all sort of plays out. Now, what's interesting is we talked about kind of some of the politicization and the divisions that I think a lot of churches that ended up then sort of picking up some of those thirds that left tended to be those that sort of went to one sort of pole or the other. In other words, a little bit more of that ways in which the church itself became kind of politicized. During that period, actually, remember having a conversation with the staff member who talked to somebody from our church who said, it seems like this church used to really be a Republican church, and now it feels like we're becoming a Democrat church. And I heard that, and I spoke to it in the sermon to say, this church has never been a Republican church, and as long as I'm here in a leadership role, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure we never become a Democrat church. So we're not going to get into that, pulled into that kind of partisan politics, and then try to, stay above the partisanship, speak to political realities that we have to speak to from a biblical perspective, but not to get sort of pulled into the polarization that sometimes happens. But it tended to be the churches that went sort of to one pole or another that really, in a lot of ways, actually grew during that period of time. And so, I think we've tried to navigate some of that differently. I think the people who are with us and are people who say, I want a church that's going to operate like that. Then I think there is this dynamic that just has to do with not only, who left, who stayed, and all, but the dynamic that comes from the online, just the hybrid experience. We recently did a survey where we were looking at, attendance patterns in our church, and just recognizing that there's a significant portion of people who maybe get 4 Sundays a month, but they're a hybrid of in-person and online. So if it used to be the case that somebody showed up in person for 2 Sundays a month, and then they were just off the other 2 Sundays, and now they're showing up in person 1 Sunday a month, but they're online 2 of the others, so that's a 3, Sunday total. Is that a net gain or is that a net loss? Well, it looks like in the room a net loss because there's fewer people in the room.
Right.
But you actually have people that are engaged even more frequently. So just that dynamic that online is something that people are absolutely choosing to make part of their church experience. Interestingly enough, even some of the trends that we saw in this recent church-wide survey, it's actually some of our older people in the church that are really leaning into the online option of sometimes they're in person, sometimes they're joining online. And so that is here to stay, but it does make an impact then when you look around the room and it feels like there's a lot more empty seats, but there's a lot of folks that are at home that are engaging in what we're doing. But then the other aspect of that I think has to just be addressed is the recognition that, as we've kind of talked about it, online, that digital experience is a wonderful supplement to our life of worship and community, but it's a terrible replacement for it, right? That's it's a blessing to be able to, when you're sick or when you're traveling or when there's other circumstances that keep you away. It's wonderful to have the option to be able to join online. But if that replaces, right, if that becomes your primary experience of both worship and community, then you're sort of settling for something that is really less than, I think, the fullness of what the church is supposed to be about. That so much of what we do, both in terms of worship and in terms of community, is about that embodied communal presence and experience together.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you miss about the church pre-COVID?
I think one of the first things I thought about was just the in-person presence of people. So, to what we were just been talking about, that online experience, a lot of people are engaging with that. And it's not just people that are sick or can't leave their homes. Some people are choosing to do that. And so there are Sundays where it feels like there's not a whole lot of people here. And yet we're hearing all these things from this broader audience of people that are engaging in services with us. And so I probably would say that, especially I think as when you're preaching, I find that really hard where I can't engage in person with people, and it's hard to do that through a screen.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly for me, and especially even as a preacher, we've talked about the fact that for a long time, and still the numbers are pretty close. When you look at our 9 o'clock worship service, the number of folks who are in person and then the number of folks who are online, for a long time we actually had more people online than we did in person. And right now the numbers look fairly even.
Yeah.
And so 9 o'clock, we actually have more people watching online at 9 o'clock than we do 10:45. And then the opposite is true with regard to in person. We have more people at 10:45 and less at 9 o'clock. And so we have this big room and kind of spread out the 9 o'clock experiences. So for me as a preacher, I'm up there doing that, like the connection with the people in the room, I think it's challenging. When there's that much space. I think one of the things I would say to folks who are listening, maybe they're part of that 9 o'clock in-person service, of like, move down and in. Like, if we could all just commit together to move down and in, it's going to actually be a better experience for everybody. Certainly as a preacher, I'm not saying do it for me, because it actually has an impact for the worshipers too. But for me as a preacher, that opportunity to really have that sense of connection with the people in the room, be able to make eye contact, and just the energy that comes from the people. If people are more concentrated down and in, that's going to be a different dynamic for me as a communicator. But then also for the people that are sitting in the seats. We've talked for years about this idea of what's called social facilitation, the law of social facilitation. And you think about it, for example, in like a stand-up comedy routine or a movie. I showed Kim this comedian the other day coming off of the celebrity lookalike. I was showing Kim some clips from Nate Bargatze, and the difference even in the way that I laughed listening to this with her as we're watching it together versus when I'm watching it by myself. I might find it funny, but I'm unlikely to just guffaw, laugh out loud. Whereas we're watching it together, and like I'm belly laughing, but because there's something about that experience that we're doing together. You might sit at home and watch a comedy film and not ever laugh audibly, even if you find it funny. But if you're sitting in a theater, the whole theater is going to really laugh. This is the idea of social facilitation. And for us as believers, it's just, we say, well, that's the way God made us, that our experience collectively together is heightened as we are in that kind of concentrated. And so you think about the impact of that with regard to our worship, and the more we are spread out through the room, the less sense of connection that we have to each other, and that whole experience, I think, is diminished. And so there's an opportunity for us to just move down and in, to come together for this experience that God has designed us as social creatures to engage together collectively in this kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, you even just think about singing. So our singing is directed to God, certainly. It's how we praise and thank him. But our singing is also directed to each other, where we're reminding each other of the truth of God's character, and we're admonishing and teaching one another, as Paul talks about in Colossians 3, against doubt and despair as we sing together. So when we're spread out or when we're not in the room, you can't actually do that sitting on your couch, right? You have to be in the room, and if you're all spread out, that doesn't work as well as when we're up close next to each other, and I hear you next to me. And there are days that we walk into that room, I know for me, where I don't know if I can sing because of despair or whatever's going on in my life, but I hear you singing next to me, and that pours courage into me.
So good.
And so
if you sing by yourself, then you don't have to hear yourself out of tune.
That's true. Yes.
Okay, let's swing the other direction. What's something that you're excited about the church post-COVID?
I think we have a really great opportunity, as we're talking about people's desire for community and connection and authenticity. The church should be the best at doing that because it's how God has wired us. And it's such an important part of our discipleship. And so it's such a unique and a real opportunity for us to help people enter into meaningful relationships with one another as they pursue life with Jesus together. And so thinking about what does that look like? And it's part of some of the work that we're even doing right now. What does that look like for us as the church to help people do that, to really go deeper? I think of even, millennials and Gen Z, and the way those generations are wired is that's what they're looking for. They want to go deeper in discipleship to Jesus, and they want to do that in a place where they can be deeply connected with one another. And so thinking through, what does that look like in 2024, and how do we help people? How do we foster that kind of environment?
Yeah, that's good. I think about even that dynamic that I mentioned before about especially that third of your people who going through that pandemic experience solidified their sense of commitment. We are all in, maybe more than we ever have been before. And I definitely think that's something that I'm just so grateful for and really love is I, again, think about specific people who I go, man, that they are in at IBC. They're in with what we're doing together. They are committed, and so there's something that I think really strengthened in a lot of regards in that way. And I think one of the other things is the number of new people that we have reached on this side of that whole experience. We have a third of our congregation, according to this recent survey, a third of our congregation that's new since 2021. So a third of the congregation that didn't live through that experience with us, but it's in some ways kind of coming out of that experience that they found IBC and have gotten plugged in and connected here. And so that fresh kind of new energy, vitality of people who are finding the church, increasing in our diversity, reflecting more and more the diversity of the community into which God has called us. And so that's been something that's really been exciting, been energizing to really see. I think that's
it's good.
I'm excited about the creativity part of it. I was reading this article the other day. It was a Young Life article, and they were talking about just all the stuff that they tried to do during the pandemic to reach people. All the creative things, outdoors, online, all the stuff. And it kind of opened that door, kind of rejuvenated that for the church to get really creative of how to reach people, that now we can't go back. We can't shut the box and just
let's go back to what we used to do.
Go back to what we always done. How do we keep the creative stuff? It kind of gave the church permission to really think outside the box and to try new things and all of that. And I think that's one of the things I'm excited about the church moving forward. We're going to see new ways of reaching people and sharing the gospel that we've just never seen before.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, it's been 4 years. I'm sure we'll do the podcast again in 4 more years. And 8 years since March 2020. Okay, at the end of each episode, we have some banter, have some fun, and let's just stay there. What got you through 2020 to where things locked down, you're at home so much? What took up your time? What did you do?
Zoom meetings.
Lots of Zoom.
Never
meetings.
opened Zoom so much.
Who knew about Zoom before 2020, right?
I smoked my pipe a lot.
You were saying that. Yeah.
I don't smoke a pipe all that often anymore. But yeah, that became like a thing that I could do where just in the evenings after a full day of Zoom meetings, I'd go out and sit on the patio and
during Zoom meetings,
maybe occasionally during Zoom meetings. And so, we've joked on here before about my love for West Wing, but that was actually when I went back through and rewatched the whole series. I don't even remember what kind of put me onto it. But started watching West Wing during COVID lockdown. And there was actually something about it that was really, inspiring, but also sort of like, well, as challenging as this is, we're not, making decisions that are the leader of the free world here.
Right.
And so there was just something that was enjoyable in terms of perspective, watching that show through the lens of leadership. And so that was definitely for me. I think about, our family, and it was crazy because so our kids are older, our boys were in their late teens, but during COVID lockdown, like our dining room table just became taken over by Legos, and so it was really cool to see my kids sort of reconnect as older teenagers around this thing that they enjoyed so much doing together when they were little. Because now we're just here and it's just us. We're just together. And so they just spent hours sitting at the table and building these amazing Lego creations. So that was actually something I really look back on fondly, watching my kids do.
So Legos, West Wing, and a pipe.
Yeah.
And Zoom.
2020.
There you go.
For Barry. Yeah, mine was, I did watch West Wing during that time too. I think the thing about it was they were always adapting to a new challenge. So it felt a little reflective of like, well, that's kind of what we're doing on a lesser scale.
I was kind of making everybody watch it. Or at least encouraging everybody to watch it.
So we watched
and
that.
And then you changed to Ted Lasso.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was 2021.
One. Yeah,
that was
everyone
else's.
Yeah. So West Wing, I think I also did watch, like, I like an old series that has a ton of seasons that I could just, like, watch all the way through.
Like The Bachelor?
No,
not
that.
No.
Not like that. Like I watched Parenthood was another one that I watched.
That's a good
I
show.
had never seen Parenthood like when it was actually airing.
I cried at
I
the end of that.
I watched that. I did too. It was really good.
I've never actually watched it.
I think there's like
I watched
7 or
The
8
Americans.
Seasons.
Remember The Americans?
I watched that too.
I watched that during
that was
the
good.
pandemic. Yeah,
I didn't watch that.
It's really good.
I just got really excited about that because I don't know anybody else who watched that show.
Let's go.
And then I think the other thing that got me through the pandemic was, so I think there was a lot of intentionality in my sort of circle of family and friends to say, okay, how do we, because I didn't go to New Jersey where I'm from for I think 2 years. I couldn't travel back until, it was like 2022 is when I went back. And so how do we now still stay engaged in a relationship, and how do we be intentional about that? And so I really appreciated the circle of friends that I had and the family that I had, that we were making real intentions to say, we're going to get together on Zoom or a phone call, but we're going to do this every week or every 2 weeks or whatever it is. And so that was really helpful to me to be able to still stay engaged in relationships. And then I think I did a lot of cooking, because what else could you do, right?
That was mine.
Yeah. Back when we were I remember going to the store. They would bring the groceries out, load them in the back of the car, take them home, unload them in the garage, wipe everything down with the bleach wipe before you bring it into the house. And that was a crazy experience. Andy and I, so Pastor Andy, my predecessor here at IBC, prior to the pandemic, we would get together every other Tuesday afternoon and smoke a cigar together. And he's just kind of coaching me, mentoring me through the whole experience. And so us continuing to do that on Zoom was a big thing that for me as a leader, getting through that season of just having this presence in my life, this ongoing, mentoring relationship was a really significant thing. So you were saying though about cooking.
No, I just got really into cooking during the pandemic, and we had, I think a lot of people had like their like 1 or 2 families or people that they were part of like their inner bubble that, y'all would hang out through the pandemic. So that family would come over every Saturday. I would cook something new, and it was like they were just my guinea pigs for like a whole year. But then I cooked throughout the week, and I end up loving it. And
it's great.
It's like, what else can I cook now?
Right.
And
was that when you really got into smoking meats, or had you were doing
smoking,
briskets
grilling, all the stuff, and it was just like, this is fun. And we started back watching American Idol then, and now we've watched it like every year since then. So the past 4 years, I know. It's kind of
your rotation of shows is just fascinating.
Great.
To me.
It's like my food.
Yeah. Yes, it's like your food. Yeah.
But yeah, American Idol and cooking. We just had our daughter, so that was wild for us.
Yeah.
Mila was born in late February, so it was 3 weeks later. Everything shuts down.
Wow.
So I was on a 4-week paternity leave.
Unbelievable.
And so it shuts down in the middle of that. So we all, inside of our family, we kind of joked that it was like the longest paternity leave ever.
Wow. That's right. Yeah.
And Barb was like, for our family, this was, she goes, you get to stay home. And
it
so,
worked out in some ways.
Yeah.
Right?
And no one met our daughter for a long time.
Right.
And outside of that family. And so, and now she just runs around this church.
She does.
And eats candy. All right. Well, good episode. It was good chatting. We'll be back next week for another week of Formed. Yeah, I didn't really end this right, but there you go. See you next week.
Yeah.